Hi, Dr. Esselstyn, and welcome to the Real Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thank you so much for being here.
AJ, what a pleasure to be with you and explore some of these exciting venues.
I'm so excited to talk to you, Dr. Esselstyn, because the diet that you've recommended for years to your patients that have heart disease, even advanced heart disease, is also unparalleled for weight loss. So, what is this diet and why is it so effective for not only reversing heart disease, even end stage heart disease, but also for people that are wanting to lose weight?
It is kind of fascinating how so many beneficial things fold into the whole package when we're eating correctly. Um, when we started our program in 1985, when we started our first group of patients, I was really sort of borrowing information that I had learned in sort of this global review that I had been doing initially to try to understand if there was less breast cancer, because the one of the motivating factors that got me interested in nutrition, which is a little bit unusual for a general surgeon, was when I was chairman of our breast cancer task force. I became increasingly disillusioned with the fact that for no matter how many women I was doing breast surgery, I was doing absolutely nothing for the next unsuspecting victim, which led to a bit of a global review. And during the global review, it was apparent that there were cultures where breast cancer rates were 30 and 40 times less frequent than the United States. For example, in rural Japan in the 1950s, breast cancer was really quite infrequently identified. And yet, as soon as the Japanese women would migrate to the United States, by the second and third generation, still pure Japanese American, they now had the same rate of breast cancer as their Caucasian counterpart. Perhaps equally or more so compelling was the amount of prostate cancer in the entire nation of Japan, autopsy proven, 1958, 18 cases. The most mind-boggling public health figure I think I've ever heard. But by 1978, 20 years later, they were up to 137, which still pales in comparison to the 28,000 men who will die this year in this country from prostate cancer. But somewhere along the line in this review, it became apparent to me that there would be more bang for the buck, shall we say, looking at cardiovascular disease, because here it was, the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, which was virtually non-existent in multiple cultures that were thriving on whole food, plant-based nutrition without oil. So that was kind of how this diet was selected and was chosen. Now, there are a number of very important, I think, caveats to go into this. First of all, when you look at some newsreels of Americans back in the late 20s, early 30s, they they all looked like they had overalls on and they were slender. And the reason that they were slender is it was interesting that it wasn't until really in the 19 teens, early 20s, that I think really some food habits became quite different. This is when the oils began to be introduced into foods, and it was kind of historically fascinating. I'm not sure I've got this right, but I'll take a stab at it. And that is, I think there was a gentleman from Ireland and one in the United Kingdom who came to this country and settled in Cincinnati in the late 19th century, and they married sisters, and their names were Procter and Gamble. And what was interesting was that they developed this business together, and part of that business, Cincinnati had an unusual reputation. It wasn't called Cincinnati then; it was sort of called the Hog City, because apparently, without refrigeration and railroad cars, the fat on hogs would withstand these journeys. But the Procter and Gamble hired a German scientist who taught them how to hydrogenate this hog fat And this was about 1913. And then there was the most incredible marketing plan of all time. And they called this hydrogenated fat, they called it Crisco. And suddenly now all restaurants and all housewives began using Crisco.
Wow.
Crisco not only as a saturated fat, but it was tasty, and everybody wanted it, and they didn't know that there was any great harm in it, and it just took off, like wildfire for 40 or 50 years. And so as people began to eat out, and that became more fashionable after World War One, they were always eating oil, and then they were cooking homemade Crisco. And I think this was not an observation to be taken lightly, because here suddenly was a very painless way of getting all these additional calories while you were eating something that was really quite delicious. Now, so while not all of the patients that I see for heart disease are overweight, a great many are. And of course, that overweight is such a brutal effect on the body. It leads to inflammation, predisposes to diabetes, predisposes to heart disease, predisposes to cancer. So there are really some severe downsides to from when people wrap themselves up in this suet, uh, uh, which we call obesity. It just is very, very, very unhealthy. Now, for the patients who have heart disease, when we ask them, what we're asking them to do is we're asking them to simply renourish, restore the health of the delicate innermost lining of their artery, the endothelium, because all experts in this disease would agree that where this disease has its inception, its onset, its beginning, is when we progressively injure the life jacket and the guardian of our blood vessel, which is the endothelium, because the endothelium manufactures this magic molecule of gas, nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a great protector and salvation of all our vasculature. Why? Because nitric oxide has these absolutely unique functions, such as one, nitric oxide will keep all the cellular elements within our blood vessels flowing smoothly like Teflon rather than Velcro. It keeps things from getting sticky. Number two, nitric oxide is the strongest blood vessel dilator in the body. When you climb stairs, the arteries to your heart, the arteries to your legs, they widen, they dilate. That's nitric oxide. Number three, nitric oxide. Nitric oxide protects the wall of the artery from becoming thickened, stiff, or inflamed, protects us from high blood pressure or hypertension. Number four. Now, number four is the absolute key. A safe and adequate amount of nitric oxide will protect us all from ever developing blockages or plaque. So literally everybody on the planet, whether they're from London, Berlin, Chicago, New York, or Cincinnati, if they have cardiovascular disease, it is because by now they have so severely in previous decades trashed, injured, and compromised the capacity of their endothelial cells to make nitric oxide. They simply don't have enough to protect themselves from developing blockages and plaque. They've turned their endothelial system into an absolute train wreck. Now, the exciting thing here and the good news is that this is not a malignancy. This is a completely benign foodborne illness. And once you can get patients, get it through their brain, into their head, how they produce this disease by destroying the endothelial production of nitric oxide, it gets them to agree never again to have passed through their lips a morsel of food that is going to further take that already train-wrecked endothelium and wreck it even further. Because then the endothelial cells will recover. You make enough nitric oxide so the disease, excuse me, so the disease cannot progress. And we often see significant elements of disease reversal. Now, here is where the weight loss comes in. Because what I am very fussy and old-fashioned and insistent upon is that I don't want my patients to ever again, ever again injure further their endothelium. I want it to come back as rapidly as possible. I want them to stop their disease. Now, the foods that we take away are the foods that have been demonstrated scientifically to show that you injure the endothelial production of nitric oxide. And we start with not a drop of any oil. Olive oil, corn oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, coconut oil, palm oil, oil on a cracker, oil on a piece of bread, oil on a salad dressing. Oil injures the endothelial cell, and it also is a huge amount of calories. Every tablespoon, 120 calories. Mm-hmm. So when you take away the oil, you are taking away a significant number of calories. And the same is true of the other thing we don't want, was any animal protein. That is to say, meat, fish, chicken, fowl, turkey, and eggs, gone. And there again, huge number of calories, gone. And then third, no dairy, milk, cream, butter, cheese, ice cream, and yogurt. When you take that away, another bunch of calories. And sugary drinks, Coke, Pepsi, and sugary foods. Cakes, pies, cookies, stevia, agave, any excesses of maple syrup, molasses, and honey. And there they go, more calories. So what you've got you're adequately nourishing people with the healthiest diet on the planet. And at the same time, you're removing a significant number of calories. Now, the other thing that I am a little fussy about is I don't like these patients to have to eat any more flour. 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 Because what is flour? Flour, when it's making pasta, bread, rolls, and bagels, it's just always, when you think about it, when you take a grain and you turn it into flour, you really extracted the most nutrient portion of grain. And the manufacturers recognize this, and so they try to resolve it by sprinkling little tiny bits of nutrients back into this flour, and they call it enriched, which is, shall we say, modestly misleading. So what they are doing, they're taking a marvelous product of grain, destroying its integrity, shall we say, and turning it into a very unhealthy product with a lot of calories. So when you take away the flour, the pasta, the bread, the rolls, the bagels, and you've taken away the oils, and you've taken away the wood meat, and the dairy, and the sugar, well, now you're really going to trim down those calories, and very few people who do this correctly just don't end up normalizing their weight. Now, there is one other wrinkle that we seem to have borrowed from the National Institutes of Aging. And that is something that is really quite a boost. Let's suppose you've got somebody who weighs 400 pounds and they've had a nice drop. And they started out as they've stopped the oil, they stopped the meat, they stopped the dairy, they stopped the sugar, they stopped the pasta, bread, rolls, and bagels. And now they're down from 400 pounds and they're down to 275. And they say, I just seem to have plateaued here. Well, this is something as I say, we borrowed from the National Institutes of Aging. And what it consists of, it's very powerful, it's very safe, but it does require, I think, some real interaction with the patient to explain to them how they're not being punished, and this is just going to accelerate them moving into a much healthier direction. And that is asking them to have water only fast on Monday and Thursday. This avoids the weekend, and yet it really is another great forward thrust, getting them towards the weight that both of you would like to see. So those are just some of the thoughts that I've ever had around this that seem to seem to work. Also, I should mention that I do not use nuts and avocado. I know I'm a bit of an outlier there, but I'll explain the rationale for that. And how many people do you know who will eat one nut?
I don't personally know anyone.
Nuts are tasty, they are delicious, and they have a lot of saturated fat. And if I ever say to my patients that it's okay to have three walnuts on your morning cereal or three walnut halves, that's not what they're going to hear, because they'll talk to their friends or relatives, and there's somewhere along the line it'll be that said that Esselstyn said that nuts are okay. And once you do that, they're in the glove compartment, they're in the kitchen, they're in the bathroom, they're in the hallway, the living room. I mean, they're easy to lay out there and they're easy to eat. And also, nuts have a huge amount of saturated fat as you start eating these. And that's not a good thing for patients with heart disease either. And the other thing that haunts me a little bit about the nut situation is I have yet to see a single study where patients who are seriously ill with heart disease are given the green light for things like peanut butter and nuts and cashew sauce and have their disease melt away. That study, I have not ever seen it. Somebody might try to say something about one branch of the Predimed study, but the Predimed study had an interesting title. It was the prevention of cardiovascular disease with the Mediterranean diet. And I received a phone call from a reporter for the New York Times saying if would I like to comment on this. It seemed to be disagree with what I was saying. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to comment, because if you looked at the three different dietary groups in the Predimed study, there was the Mediterranean diet with nuts, Mediterranean diet with oil, and the study that was called low fat that was between 39 and then later 37%, which is hugely high fat. Now, it was interesting that as they followed these patients for 5 years, and remember this, and this is the most important thing, nobody would qualify for the study unless they were absolutely free of cardiovascular disease. So they started with this group of 5,000 people without cardiovascular disease. And over the next 5 years, in every single one of those dietary groups that had no cardiovascular disease at the start, ended up in each group, there were scores of patients succumbed to death, heart attack, and stroke. But the stroke rate was higher in the group having the high-fat diet. So my comment was to the reporter was, I think the title is wrong. It should be the creation of cardiovascular disease with the Mediterranean diet.
That's amazing. It's great though, isn't it, that the foods that harm the endothelial are always the animal products and the processed foods, and they're so favorable for weight loss when we don't eat these. I mean, it just worked out perfectly. Nature really had it right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Dr. Esselstyn, sometimes I hear from people that adopt your diet that and they're losing weight, that sometimes their numbers go up initially, like maybe their cholesterol, their HDL, their LDL, their triglycerides. And because they don't have a doctor such as yourself, their physician will want to put them on medication. Could you please explain why sometimes that when someone is losing weight and reversing heart disease, initially their numbers might go up and that they don't need to run and get a script right away?
Well, remember, if they're if they're losing weight fairly rapidly, sometimes what are they living on? They're living on fat, their own fat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that may have a tendency to push these numbers up when they settle down. But also remember that I'm not aware that we can say that I don't know of a single number that causes heart disease. Heart disease has never been caused by a number. Heart disease is caused by what is passing through your lips every day.
Right.
Has the capacity to destroy your endothelial cell ability to make nitric oxide. And while we're on that, I just want to finish up with one thing because I don't want to overlook the fact that, well, it's not in my book. We've made it a, a new dimension in helping the patients with heart disease, in that recognizing the importance of nitric oxide and the fact that we want to get it back as rapidly as we can. I now ask the patients that we knew when we see them new the first time to imagine that they could shrink their head to a size that they could crawl inside and look at the plaque in their arteries. They would see that that plaque is an absolute cauldron of oxidative inflammation. So we need antioxidants. But no, do not go down to the health food store and buy a jug of pills that says antioxidant, because it doesn't work and it's going to be harmful. We want those patients to get their antioxidants from food. Fair enough. What food? Food that is high in what we call ORAC value, oxygen radical absorptive capacity. So if you're having raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, and blackberries on your morning oat cereal, that is a terrific start. But nothing can trump the antioxidant value of green leafy vegetables. So I need my patients with heart disease that first year or two to chew, not smoothies, not juicing. I want them to chew a green leafy vegetable 6 times a day that is roughly the size of your fist after it has first been boiled in water 5.5 to 6 minutes, so it's now nice and tender. Then you must anoint it with several drops of a delightful balsamic vinegar. Why? Because the acetic acid in the vinegar has been shown to restore the nitric oxide synthase enzyme, which is contained within the endothelial cell and responsible for making nitric oxide. And also, when you are chewing this green leafy vegetable, you are chewing a nitrate. As you chew the nitrate, it is going to be reduced in your mouth by the facultative anaerobic bacteria that reside in the crypts and grooves of your tongue. It will be reduced from nitrate to nitrite. When you swallow the nitrite in your stomach will now be further reduced by your gastric acid to nitric oxide, which can now enter the nitric oxide pool. So here, when you add these greens, it is a double header. You're improving the endothelial production of nitric oxide, and you're initiating its production from your gastrointestinal tract. And that's now you're going to say, well, what are the greens I'm talking about? They are black chives, Swiss chard, kale, collards, collard green, beans, mustard greens, turnip greens, napa cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, cilantro, parsley, spinach, and arugula, and asparagus. And the top 5 are kale, Swiss chard, spinach, arugula, and beans.
Nice. That's amazing. And you actually eat these every day.
Not all of them.
No, I know, no, but that would take all day.
Yeah.
Well, it's so great because the foods that are so protective for the endothelial also help people lose weight. And I don't know if you know this, Dr. Esselstyn, and I found this out quite by accident, is that there's some compound in these dark leafy greens called thylakoids that actually make people not feel hungry. It turns off the hunger switch and fights cravings. So it's a win-win because all these foods that you tell people not to eat, meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, processed oil, flour, sugar, even nuts, avocado, they're a high caloric density, but I'm not so sure about if the nuts injure the endothelial, but as you said, it's hard sometimes to get people to moderate them. But what about the foods that you want people to eat other than greens and berries? So let's talk about those. Are they all have high ORAC capacity, or what do we eat? Can't just eat oats, berries, and greens. So
what we want these people to eat are the whole grains.
Right.
The rice, you can have the wheat berries, you can have the barley, the rye, the buckwheat and farro and quinoa. I mean, these are all delicious grains, and they can be a nice foundation for when you take the wok and make a stir fry with all these wonderful vegetables you pour on top of these nutritious grains. In addition to the grain, there's 101 different types of legumes, lentils, and beans. All the marvelous red, yellow, and green leafy vegetables, as well as sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, and fruit. And now there's so many wonderful books that are available out there with these foods represented in such a delicious fashion that everybody can get used to it. And what happens when you do this is you rapidly downregulate the both the fat receptor in your brain and the sugar receptor. And as you do this, then suddenly you begin to really taste the natural flavors of all these plant-based foods, and there'd be no going back to the greasy meat. And
Could you talk a little bit about that down regulation process, Dr. Esselstyn? Because I have so many people that say it's so hard. I mean, you and I, we love our food. We're used to it. We've eaten it for many years. But for people coming from either the standard American diet or a high fat vegan diet, they say they have so many cravings and that the food doesn't taste good. So how long does it take for this, the fat and the sugar receptors to down regulate so that people can really enjoy Anne's recipes or Jane and Rip's recipes and all the wonderful Esselstyn cookbooks?
well, you have to remember that before I started this, that I grew up on an Aberdeen Angus on a beef farm and a dairy farm, and I was really a classic cholesterolholic, and and yet, as I mentioned, it was about I guess in 1983 and 4 when I began prodding myself as all this information was coming forth, and I suddenly realized that you know I'm going to have to do this. I cannot ask patients to do this until I've done it for at least a year for myself, and because by then I had done enough of the global research to know that there was a profound difference in these disease manifestations that had to be related to food, and as a family we were going to have to do it in hand. And Anne was really pretty wonderful and game to give this a try. But I will be honest with you, when we first started this, my receptors were not down regulated, and I thought, my God, this food could gag a maggot. And don't quote me on that.
No, no.
And,
Oh,
but suddenly it was within a matter of weeks it really began to work out. And then there was wonderful research that came from the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia, and they had done a very interesting study where they took over a 12-week period. They took 3 groups of patients with different levels of fat. One at something like 34%, another it's 20% fat, and another one down around 10 or 12%, where we are with our program. And at the end of 12 weeks, one of those groups had now lost their craving for fat, and that was a group that was quite low. So at 12%, well, now you can understand why it is that some people will say, well, Dr. Esselstyn, this is a very significant dietary change, and I would agree. But to call it extreme, severe, and strict and draconian, I think is a little excessive. Because once you can get patients to understand the rationale behind this, and this is why you do it precipitously, because if you try to have people just eat this way during the week and let them go back and belly up to the trough on the weekends, eat whatever they want to eat, then what happens is you never end up down regulating your fat receptor.
right.
The fat receptor stays high, and then you're constantly, in sort of, when you're trying to do it right, you're in a state of misery and denial, and you're going to have recidivism. It's going to fail. So you really want to kind of keep it simple, have them understand that this is they're going to hit the promised land in just a few weeks.
Right. I think sometimes they just don't give it enough time. You often talk about populations in the world that actually eat this way, not because they're trying to reverse heart disease or lose weight.
Yeah, I mean, I think this when one of the things that's so important when you're working with patients, put them in a mindset that they are not going to be denied something that they treasure. You see, unfortunately today, every time groups gather for meetings or what have you, there's always food. And almost 99% of the time, it's going to be food that is hideously harmful. I mean, you'll see cardiologists having a morning meeting with glazed donuts. And
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy. And every time you have a picnic or a soiree or maybe even a church gathering, there's going to be food there that is just going to melt your arteries. So when you're starting with these patients, you really want to encourage them and get them in a mindset to understand that the most extreme, strict, and severe diet on the planet is the one that 97% of Americans are eating. And that is the reason that they are sitting there in front of me, because they have eaten enough of those foods to absolutely devastate the arteries to their most vital organ, their heart and their brain. And the exciting thing is you can really turn this around without medication. With all due respect to my cardiovascular colleagues, really none of the pills, none of the stents, and none of the bypasses that are offered have one single solitary thing to do with the causation of the illness. The causation of the illness is what has been passing through their lips every day since they were children. It is continuing to destroy the endothelial cell capacity to make nitric oxide to protect themselves.
I don't know if you'll remember this, Dr. Esselstyn. It was about 10 years ago, and you were speaking in Century City, California at a conference. It wasn't a plant-based conference, but it was a medical conference. And there was several hundred doctors in the audience, and they were actually eating Danishes and drinking coffee. And you were talking about this, and you said, how many of you had greens for breakfast? And I was in the back, and I raised my hand, and I said, I did. And you said, well, then I want to meet you. And I actually came up afterwards, and that was the first time we met over 10 years ago. And I still eat greens for breakfast 10 years later.
There you go.
Yep, absolutely.
And the cardiologists are still having donuts.
Right. and they'll always be in business.
In all fairness, 3 years ago, I received an invitation from the American College of Cardiology to become a member. A little unusual for a general surgeon to be a member. But, and they wanted me to join their nutrition committee, which I have very willingly and gladly done. And I'm very proud of that committee and its leadership, Dr. Andrew Freeman. And it's trying very hard, if it can, to educate cardiologists about what is the causation of the illness that they have been designated to treat. But even today, I mean, invariably, when patients call and want to come to our intensive counseling seminar that I conduct, at the Cleveland Clinic once a month, at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute once a month. The exciting thing is that that we're going to be able to try to have these patients. Oh, I should mention that physician. We have more or less. I give an open house invitation to any physician who simply wants to come and become familiar with our program and what we do. But the American College of Cardiology is trying very hard through the nutrition committee to make cardiologists aware of this. And I don't mean to be hard on my cardiovascular colleagues, but at no time in medical school or no time in their postgraduate training in cardiology have they ever received any really education in depth into the causation of the illness they're treating. And so when I see these patients and they tell me that they told their cardiologist they were going to come to my program, the cardiologist unknowingly will say, well, that's just a waste of time or a waste of your money. And yet increasingly now in the last year or two, we've had some of them say, well, is that right? Well, that's really kind of fascinating. I read about that program and I've heard that it will work. He said, but I tried it a few times here and they said patients just wouldn't do it. Well, when a cardiologist says the patients won't do it, invariably it's because they've tried to mention it to them in a 10 or 15-minute office visit. Now, we're talking about a very, very serious lifestyle change. And if you think for 1 minute, because you have the ego of being a interventional cardiologist or somebody with all this information and knowledge, and your patient won't do it because you give it in 10 or 15 minutes, don't be surprised, because that doesn't work. We found that the reason we're running about a 90% acceptance at this time of our method, and when we wrote up some 200 of these patients several years ago, is that if you're going to have a lifestyle change, you must show the patient respect. And the only way that I know to show a patient respect is to give them my time. And so what has evolved now is that we have a 6-hour, single day intensive counseling seminar for patients throughout Canada, throughout the United States, and from overseas who come for counseling. And in that counseling, they're going to learn all about how they have created their disease and precisely how we are going to empower them as the locus of control to halt and to reverse their disease. And before these patients ever come to our seminar, my secretary, if they've signed up, will give me a list with their phone numbers. And 2 weeks before the seminar begins, I personally, maybe I'm a little old-fashioned, but I personally insist on calling every one of them myself to get my arms around their story, and at the same time give them an opportunity to ask questions of me, so that coming to the seminar, we have a strong platform from which we can all move forward. And what we have at the seminar, in addition to what I mentioned about having them understand how they created this disease and how they can be empowered to stop it, everybody gets a very hefty notebook. And in the notebook is going to be a copy of every PowerPoint slide that I use, several of our scientific articles, a 44-page handout with many additional recipes, which will combine with the 240 recipes in the 2 books that we provide them. And there's going to be a marvelous hour-and-a-quarter presentation from a woman who's had 30 years experience acquiring and preparing plant-based foods, dealing with reading, ingredients, travel, and restaurants. And then everybody's going to receive a DVD of the entire seminar,
Wow.
from an earlier one, because should they go home and get forgetful or rusty, they can flip this on and get themselves back up to speed. And then we always have 3 local or regional participants who went to a very fine cardiovascular institute where their cardiovascular disease was just devastated. Their disease got worse, their bypasses failed, their leg operations failed. And when all was looking dark on the horizon, somehow they came to our program. And this is now 5 or 6 years earlier they did this. And they absolutely blossomed. They totally turned it around. And it's such, when they tell their story, you can just hear the people who are in attendance say to themselves, listen, if he or she can do this, I can.
Yeah.
And then we give them a wonderful plant-based luncheon, answer all questions, and then stay in touch as necessary through email or phone call. And when I think they see and I should mention that always, whenever possible, the spouse is in attendance. They come for free. Because
Nice.
if you think you're going to make this kind of profound lifestyle change without the spouse there, and this is why it doesn't work in a doctor's office. You give them 10 or 15 minutes, the partner isn't there, they're not about to change.
But I like what you said about having the family on board. So my question is, how important do you think it is to have a clean environment to be successful? Because we have so many people that are trying to get healthy and lose weight, and their children or their spouse don't want to do it. So they have a lot of these tempting foods in their house. Do you think that's a good idea?
To have tempting foods in your house?
Right.
No, that's a good idea. But, you see, one of the things that that would accelerate this. There are a lot of things that would accelerate it, but those of us who are on the nutrition committee of the American College of Cardiology are trying to have the caregivers in cardiovascular medicine be aware of what could stop this disease, be aware of what is causing this disease. And so we're starting with theoretically the most sophisticated audience. Now, the next audience certainly, and this should be done, and it's going to be brutal conflicts for many industries. But we have somehow really got to get the science out there hard enough so that this is started in childhood. Just suppose what would happen if you took the average 9, 10, or 11-year-old, and in a fashion or in vocabulary that they could get their arms around, have those 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds understand the endothelial cell in their arteries and what it's doing for them, and have them understand also what are the foods that every time they eat, they injure that, so that as they get to be in their teenage years. I mean, remember the study that was done showing that if you autopsy young women and men between the ages of 17 and 34 who have died of accidents, homicides, and suicides, cardiovascular disease is now ubiquitous. Not enough in that group to have cardiac events, but there it is already established. So you take these 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, get them exposed to that information. They're going to suddenly say, why are they offering these hot dogs to us in the lunch, in the cafeteria? Why are we getting this milk? Why are they getting this ice cream? In other words, why teach young people to have an addiction to this absolute junk food that is going to lead to illness as the years pass on? Yeah, we've got to if we can just get that in one school system and going properly, because look, let's face it, even the families of those people who run those industries are vulnerable to this illness.
Yeah, absolutely. What about things like chocolate or caffeine or salt or alcohol? How do these affect someone with heart disease or that's trying to lose weight? Would you give them thumbs up or thumbs down?
Well, I don't think you'll ever find me suggesting you use alcohol to lose weight. No, alcohol is a lot of empty calories. Alcohol is a toxin. It is a toxin to the brain. It is a toxin to the liver, and it's a toxin to the heart. Now, on the other hand, let's be reasonable about this. Therefore, if somebody wants to have a drink on Friday night or Saturday night, not necessarily both, I have no problem with that. But if somebody tells me, I need 3 glasses of wonderful red wine every night to relax, I have a problem with that. I think that can truly add up. And I think increasingly the data, there are some more recent studies that show that even modest amounts of alcohol are problematic.
Right.
So that's the alcohol. Now, the caffeine. I haven't seen the final research on this one yet, but the caffeine situation is kind of interesting. I've not seen any studies that downplay either green tea or black tea with caffeine, so I'm fine with that. But I have seen a study, as a matter of fact, 2 studies, and I'll mention the Italian one. They took this group of 2 groups of healthy young people, and they had them drink either coffee with caffeine, or the other group had the decaf. And then after they drank, they would do the brachial artery tourniquet test, which is a test for determining nitric oxide. For your listeners who aren't familiar with it, you take an ultrasound probe, place it over the brachial artery at your elbow, and there on the screen there's a readout of your ability of the artery to dilate. Okay. Then for 5 minutes you encircle the upper arm with the blood pressure cuff, inflated above systolic blood pressure, so that for 5 minutes you have absolutely zero blood flow to your forearm and hand. Now, I've had that done. It's not exactly habit forming, but then You rapidly release after 5 minutes this tourniquet, again with the ultrasound probe, again on the brachial artery at the elbow. And in the normal individual, it'll be 30% greater. So that was what they did, the group that had coffee with caffeine and the group that was decaf. Then they switched the groups. The group that formerly was decaf was now having caffeine. It was always the group that was having coffee with caffeine that they showed a clear dysfunction of the endothelial cells to make nitric oxide.
Wow, that's
So
that's something.
that was pretty weighty and profound enough for me, so that I asked my patients not to have coffee with.
Wow, terrific. What about salt?
Well, again, I don't think you have to cook with salt, and I don't think you're going to be low in. You're not going to be low in sodium if you're not cooking with salt. But if you go to a restaurant, you're going to be overwhelmed with salt. And salt can be problematic for high blood pressure, hypertension. And if people find that their food is just too flat, my friend Jeff Novick assures me that if you just take a regular salt pepper shaker, just a little bit, that in such a modest amount, just a little, don't just unload the salt shaker onto it, but just sprinkle it lightly for a little taste. That seems to be acceptable.
Right. Dr. Esselstyn, you are a former Olympic athlete. You actually won a gold medal at the Olympics. And so I'm wondering how you feel about exercise. I know it's important, but is it okay if we go to the gym to maybe be a little bit more lenient with the diet? What do you say about that?
Well, you brought up an event that I was involved with in 1956. So that's now actually about 60 some years, 60.
62 years ago.
And I should share with you that there are, in the 8-oar rowing event, which I was a part of, there are 8 oarsmen and a coxswain. And every June, the first 2 weeks of the year, for the last about 12 years, up at the farm where I grew up in upstate New York, we have our reunion. And there are now only, at this point, there are 4 of us left after the 8, and the coxswain is still living. So they're actually, the coxswain and 3 oarsmen are still alive. And that's a wonderful time to sort of share memories and swap stories. Now, as far as the, do I still do any rowing? No. Doesn't, it's just not convenient where I live to do that on a regular basis. But I do feel very strongly about exercise, and when I'm able to steer my bicycle in the right direction, I'm saying that laughing because I have not sometimes had very good. I've been a little careless. I've had a couple of bike accidents because the rumor always goes this way, that there are 2 types of cyclists: those that have crashed and those who are about to crash. But if we can put that aside for the moment, I feel the exercise that I get in an hour of trying to cycle every day that I'm available to, then there's some pretty good hills in that, so that I can get my respirations and my heart rate up into the red zone. There's really quite a bit of benefit from that on a regular basis. And then maybe 3 times a week, I can do some resistance training. And I think the data are extremely clear of the benefits of exercise, from everything from mental clarity to helping to control your weight, to really your cognitive thinking, memory, and also to protect yourself from brain atrophy, or in the case of muscle atrophy, which is sarcopenia. And But you got to kind of stick with it, and you're not something you always wake up and say to yourself, "Oh, how delightful it will be to go exercise." I mean, that's
Right.
because there are going to be days and moments when a lot of other things are on your mind, and you can kind of push that off to the side. But grit your teeth, and it's going. Because it's not hard once you get started in it. I've never yet been aware of a session once I've got into it that I immediately wanted to drop it, because once you're into it, whether it's the biking or whether it's the resistance training, you've got your program and you've outlined it and you're in there and you're under your way and you've got it going. Maybe you've got some little tune or music in the background that helps, but that's the way I think about exercise.
But it's not enough to just exercise if we don't have the diet right.
Oh, no, no, no. The calories you lose through exercise compared to what you require every day is modest, unless you're going to exercise all day long, which is
Right. So, Dr. Esselstyn, so many people have tried valiantly to lose weight and so far have not yet been successful. What makes you so confident that there really is a solution? And what would you say to people that have given up hope to ever lose weight?
well. I would say again, like I mentioned earlier, with the heart patients, you give them your time, and in the time that you have with them, you want them to grasp fully without. You don't want to do it with fear. You don't want to, but they have to be aware that carrying all this weight, they are at risk for heart disease. They are at risk for diabetes and cancer and inflammation and hypertension. When they are aware of these things, you tell them that, look, you are going to be able to do this with delicious food. Now, but there are certain foods that we have to understand, we have to absolutely eliminate. Because if you can get patients to eliminate the foods that every time they ingest them, they are injuring their artery, there goes the oil, there goes the animal protein, there goes the dairy, there goes the sugar. Okay. And what have you got? You've got weight loss. And why? And you got to have a little fun with them. They say, look, what do I do when I'm in a restaurant? Well, I said, well, wait, look, here's what you got to do. Your endothelium are at risk. You go to a restaurant, they've got salt, and they've got oil and everything, and sugar.
Hmm.
And you look at the waiter or the waitress in the eye and you say, listen, you have to understand that I am deathly allergic to a single drop of any oil. And so they look at the menu with you and you try to pick a vegetable from here and maybe a vegetable from there, a baked potato, some salad, because you bring your own dressing. And that works out. On the other hand, if you can't find anything there, then you look at him or her and you say, could I just see the chef for a minute? The chef comes out and they're so flattered. And you ask them, look, I'm being taken care of by this monster from Ohio. And I cannot have a drop of any kind of oil. I'm deathly allergic. No animal protein, no dairy, no sugar. He or she smiles and says, I'll be back in 23 minutes with a delicious. And what'll happen? Maybe I'll have beans and rice, whatever. It'll work.
Yeah.
But there are 4 reasons to go out to eat. 1 is you don't have to do the cooking. 2, you don't do the dishes. 3,
Right.
the ambiance. 4, the companionship.
Sure.
But you never, ever go out to eat to further destroy endothelial cells.
Absolutely. If you had to summarize, just to give people hope that there really is a solution.
Well, the solution obviously is to eliminate those foods that every time they pass your lips, you are going to injure yourself. You're
Right.
injuring your endothelium. Uh-huh. Yep. You're interesting. The endothelium has capacity to make nitric oxide. And you start that in childhood. You keep it up. And the exciting thing is for weight loss, the very foods that are injuring you are the very foods that are keeping you fat. All right.
Right.
Yeah. And you get rid of the oil, get rid of the animal protein, get rid
Yep.
of the dairy, and get rid of the sugar.
Absolutely. Well said. Not a drop, not a morsel, not a crumb. It's been delightful talking to you, Dr. Esselstyn.
My is this little summary, if I may. I
Oh,
think that
absolutely.
the reason I guess I find myself, even though I retired from surgery 18 years ago, I find myself so passionate about medicine today than even than when I was in surgery, is that we're truly right now on the absolute cusp of what could be a seismic revolution in health. And that seismic revolution is never going to come about from another pill, another procedure, or another operation. The seismic revolution in health that is going to come about is when we have the will and the grit and the determination to share with the public what is the lifestyle, and most specifically, what is the nutritional literacy that will empower them as the locus of control to absolutely annihilate chronic illness, not just heart disease, but also hypertension and obesity and diabetes and strokes and vascular dementia and Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, allergies, asthma, and the list goes on. It is just so magnificent. Never before has medicine in its toolbox had something that was so powerful, so enduring, so inexpensive, and so safe.
That's a beautiful note to end on, and that does give me hope. Thank you so much, Dr. Esselstyn.
AJ, my pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye.